You're all here tonight to hear about wolves. Tom Gable is the project lead for the Voyageurs Wolf Project. He's spoken to us several times before. He's recently finished up his Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota. And what he has done since 2014 is study wolves in the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem. We've seen some of his presentations before. If you haven't checked out the Voyageurs Wolf Project and watched some of their amazing video that they get on webcams and stuff, you should. And tonight, Tom is going to be talking to us about how it is that wolves hunt beavers and how important beavers are as prey for wolves in the Voyageurs ecosystem. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for inviting me back. So last time I gave a presentation, I believe it was on the work we did to understand how wolves, by killing beavers, alter wetland creation and sort of recolonization patterns in our area up in Voyageurs and probably other places in the state. And today I'm going to be talking about wolves and beavers again, but this time focused a lot more on wolf hunting behavior of beavers and sort of the work we've done to understand how do wolves actually hunt and kill beavers. This photo here actually is not from our area, but is one of the very few images or videos that exists of wolves hunting and killing beavers. It's a very challenging predator-prey dynamic to actually study because typically wolves and beavers live in dense or habitats, riparian habitats or around wetlands where the vegetation is really dense. So actually observing wolves hunting and killing beavers is very challenging, which is why so little is known about them or about their interaction. And that's why we got interested in it. Oops, let's see. Okay, here we go. So before I begin, I need to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. Austin Homkes is a field biologist on our project. Dr. Joseph Bump is sort of our other core member. He's faculty at the University of Minnesota and was my PhD advisor. And then Sean Johnson Bice is a colleague of ours at the University of Manitoba who helped out with this study. And I should say not study, but study. This is the talking community is sort of a summation of a lot of work that we've done to try to piece together how wolves hunt beavers. Okay. And then I also need to thank all of our technicians who help us in the field, and they're the ones out in the field helping collect a lot of this data, which makes it possible to make sense of these patterns between wolves and beavers. So I did want to provide, though, for anyone who's unfamiliar, just a brief sort of overview of what the project is about before we get into the specifics of wolves and beavers. So our project is a University of Minnesota project, so we're all employees of the University of Minnesota. And we've been studying wolves intensively since 2015 in an area we call the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem. And a lot of our project was really sort of buoyed by initial efforts by Voyageurs National Park to start monitoring the wolf population in and around Voyageurs National Park when wolves were removed from the endangered species list, one of the times they were removed from the endangered species lists back in 2012. So they'd started doing some basic monitoring of the population, how many packs there were, how many wolves were in each pack. And we kind of started in 2015 and kind of really ramped that up to trying to look at wolf ecology much more intensively. And our overarching objective of our project is really to look at summer ecology really intensively. There's been a lot of work on the winter ecology of wolves, a lot less on the summer ecology. So our sort of official objective is really to understand the reproductive ecology and predation behavior of wolves during the summer in the Greater Voyageurs ecosystem. Now there's a few things to note here. First, reproductive ecology just means raising pups, basically, anything that has to do with raising pups. So when we think about wolves during the summertime, they're really doing two things. They're having their pups, and then they're hunting and killing food or prey to feed themselves and to feed their pups. So if we really want to understand sort of wolves as a species during summer, we have to have a detailed understanding of both of those aspects of wolf ecology. And importantly, we consider summer to be a very broad period of time. So when I say summer, we're talking April until October, which is sort of the biological summer for wolves. And importantly, this is when beavers are available to wolf predation because That's typically corresponds when we don't have ice on the lakes and ponds, and so beavers are actually available. Once the ice forms, beavers really aren't available to wolves anymore. So if you're not familiar with where Voyageurs National Park is, it's way up in the northern part of the states, just on the western boundary, actually, of the boundary waters, and it borders Ontario. And like I said, we study wolves in an area that we call the Greater Voyageurs Ecosystem, which basically just includes Voyageurs National Park and a big chunk of land south of the park as well. And that's because very few wolf packs actually exist or live fully within the boundaries of Voyageurs National Park, because it's got this sort of odd oblong shape. And you can actually see that this is a pack territory map, and it's a little busy, but you can see here again is Voyageurs National Park, which is this yellow boundary. And there's a lot of wolf pack territories that overlap this boundary, and very few packs that actually live like solely within the park. So we wanted to understand, if we want to understand the wolves in Voyageurs National Park, we have to know what's going on outside of the park. So that's why we study wolves both in and outside the park. And you might be interested, and this is just kind of neat, how we know where these territories are. And this is actually, this is how we know. This is the GPS tracking data. These are from GPS movements of wolves in all these different packs. And so this is how we're able to understand where these territories are. And that's just one of the great things about GPS tracking technology. Okay, so that's an overview of what our project does. Now we're on to what I would call the fascinating world of wolf-beaver interactions. And I really do think it is quite fascinating. A lot of people are worried about wolves and deer, and that's important, but I think wolves and beavers are a lot more interesting. So I wanted to provide a really brief overview about what we know about wolf-beaver interactions sort of broadly, and then kind of zoom in on what we know about wolves and beavers and voyageurs. So on a broad level, we know that beavers are important prey for wolves in a variety of different ecosystems across North America and Europe and Asia. And biologists have known this for a while, based on diet studies where biologists dissected wolf scats and were able to find beaver remains in them. And these studies have been going on way back to the 1960s. And this information is good because it tells you what % of a wolf's diet might be beaver, but it doesn't provide a lot of information beyond that. It doesn't tell you how wolves hunt beavers or anything like that. But anyway, so we've known wolves are important, or beavers are important food for wolves. There's stuff in the literature that shows that beavers can make up to 50% of wolf diets during the summer, so meaning it's one of their primary food sources. But wolf-beaver interactions really haven't been studied well. And a large part of that is because, like I mentioned earlier, wolves and beavers are interacting in very dense wetland habitats that are very hard to observe. And so without our modern technology, GPS tracking, remote cameras, things like that, there really wasn't any good way to study this dynamic. But now we have the tools to do that. And so we've been able to learn a lot about it. But to give you an idea of where wolves and beavers co-occur in North America, this orange polygon shows the area of overlap, which is basically the entire boreal forest. So beavers are not an insignificant prey species, even though we generally don't think of them as that important relative to deer or other things like that. So to understand how wolves might actually go about hunting and killing beavers, we have to understand a few things about what beavers are like as prey species, because that's probably going to dictate how wolves might actually hunt them. So some of these things are probably obvious, but I think they're worth going over. What are beavers like as prey? And what do they do to avoid getting killed by wolves? So obviously they build lodges, which protect them from predators, and they dam up streams and create ponds, and that water actually creates a refuge for them that a predator can't successfully kill them in. Beavers are generally going to stay very close to water, because if they detect a predator, that is their only safety, is getting back to the water. And so they're generally not going to travel very far inland. And they don't stay on land for very long periods of time, because the longer they're on land, the higher exposure they have to predators. So they're going to limit that so that they don't run into and encounter predators. But nonetheless, beavers still have to go on land to cut trees. And so when they're on land, it's important or good to know, how do beavers actually go about detecting predators? How do they avoid encounters with them? And so when they're on land, they primarily rely on scent to detect predators. That's their best sensory ability is scent, or olfaction is the more technical term. But that's how they're detecting predators. Importantly, though, beavers do not have very good hearing because they've got small little ears, and their eyesight is really terrible. And that's largely because beavers spend half the year in darkness in their lodge during the wintertime. So they don't have well-developed eyes, and they almost certainly, can't see predators that are waiting in ambush because they just don't have the visual acuity to see predators that aren't moving. They probably can see predators that are moving just based on the vision, but they don't have the ability to make out sharp images in the way we would think of. So they're somewhat blind, you could almost say, and that will be important as we start looking into this interaction. So that's how they detect them. Now, what happens if a beaver, their ability to detect a predator fails when they run into one? What do they do then? Well, a beaver's primary defenses are their sharp teeth, which are powered by extremely powerful jaws, and those will do some serious damage if they make contact with the wolf. The other thing is simply their sheer size. And remember, a beaver just has to get to water. That's it. So if they run into a predator, they've got to get back to water. And one thing that might help them is that beavers can be very large, especially when we think about wolves and beavers. Adult beavers can get up to 55 to 60 pounds. For perspective, an adult female wolf in our area is about 55 pounds on average. So that means that there are some beavers that are literally bigger than the wolves in our area. And most importantly, beavers have a very unique body shape. They're basically a muscular football-shaped animal. They have no neck. There's not a lot of places to grab them, which would make them a lot more challenging for wolves to catch and kill. So that actually is probably one of the things that helps them when they have an encounter with wolves. So those are their defenses. Oh, and like I said, no neck. So wolves don't have anything to really grab onto when they attack them. So now, what do we know about wolves and beavers and voyagers? Well, we know that beavers are vulnerable during the ice-free season, or summer as we're going to refer to it, which is April until October. Work that we've done back in 2015 showed that beavers can make up to 42% of wolf pack diets during this time. So that means beavers are a very important food source. And then individual wolves can kill up to 42 beavers in a single summer. 42 beavers, for perspective, is 8.5 beaver lodges worth of beavers. So that is kind of staggering that one wolf is able to do that. But one of the reasons why beavers are such an important food source for wolves in our area is because the area has sustained an extremely dense beaver population for a very long time. So this map here is from a couple years ago. Every year we fly aerial surveys to plot and map all of the active beaver lodges. This is from a couple years ago, and each one of these yellow pins represents an active beaver lodge in our area. There's over 1,100 active lodges plotted on this map, which is a ton of beavers. These are probably some of the highest beaver densities in the lower 48 states, and probably rivals the densities in a lot of parts of Canada. To give you an idea of what this looks like from the air, we just have sort of mixed forests interspersed with all of these beaver-created wetlands. So this is a photo I took a couple years ago when doing these surveys. And what you can see here in this map is that each one of these white arrows is pointing to an active beaver lodge. So there's 9 lodges in this image alone. And so you can imagine if you're a wolf and you can somehow figure out how to catch beavers, that's a lot of food on the landscape to take advantage of. And so that's what really got us interested, is how do wolves actually take advantage of beavers? How do they kill them? Because like we said, beavers don't spend a lot of time on land. They're not available. So somehow wolves have to figure out how to get them when they are on land. And so that's what we were really interested in. And so that really comes down to the question, how do wolves hunt beavers? Which is really kind of the hope of today's talk, is to explain that a bit. So when we started doing our work, this book had just come out called Wolves on the Hunt, The Behavior of Wolves Hunting Wild Prey. It was written by Dave Meach, Doug Smith, and Dan McNulty, who are some of the foremost wolf biologists in the world. And really the book was a comprehensive review of how wolves hunt their various prey species. And the book was a couple hundred pages long, and but the section on beavers was about 3 paragraphs. And they concluded that there were no actual descriptions of wolves hunting beavers. So, people had ideas, speculations, but there's literally no data to actually support any of that. And that was in 2015, right when we started our work. So this was sort of great incentive for us to try to go out and try to see if we can figure out what's going on here. And so that's what we did. In 2015, we set out to understand wolf-beaver interactions. And so the way we do that and have done it is we fit wolves with GPS collars, and these collars take locations every 20 minutes and upload to a website multiple times a day. And then we can log on and basically get real-time data from those wolves. And so when those locations upload to a website, we can log on and we see something that looks about like this. This is a week's worth of GPS locations. And so what we do is we take these locations, we run it through a computer program, and that computer program identifies all of the places that this wolf or our wolves that we're studying have remained in a relatively confined area for more than 20 minutes. And what that basically indicates is that's a spot where the wolf has spent some time and there could be a kill there, or the wolf could be doing something else there. So if we took all these locations, ran it through a computer program, what would come out on the other side is this. And we refer to each one of these little clumps of locations as a cluster of GPS locations. And so what we do is we put these on our GPSs, sort of divide and conquer amongst our field crew, and we all hike out to these spots. And we search around each one of these individual locations, trying to figure out what the wolf is actually doing there. And a lot of times we're looking for kills, but we're also looking for other things as well. So when we go here, we're showing up and looking for evidence that something happened. And oftentimes we find, I shouldn't say oftentimes, but typically we find, when we find a kill, we're going to see either a beaver that was killed or a deer fawn. This is a good example of a beaver that was killed when we visited one of these clusters. So in this instance, a wolf actually dragged a beaver out of this little creek here on the right-hand side and then consumed it right there in that white circle. But this is a good example of why studying wolf-beaver interactions has been so challenging, because oftentimes wolves can almost entirely kill and consume a beaver in a very short period of time, and it can be very challenging to find the remains of those beavers later on in the field. So this is a good example of that. The next photo is going to be me looking straight down into this white circle, and you can see what I was looking at there. And you might look at this, and this is what I was seeing, and it doesn't really look like a whole lot. You can kind of make out the impression of where the wolf was laying down. And then what you can actually see if you zoom in is that all that was left of this little beaver were its 2 front teeth and stomach contents and a little bit of fur. So everything else was totally gone. And this isn't atypical of the summertime. So this is how we document where wolves kill beavers, as we find these events and take a bunch of measurements from them. And so far on our project, we've searched almost 28,000 of these clusters of GPS locations. And in doing so, we've been able to locate 522 beavers that have been killed by wolves. So that gives us a really good idea of kind of where wolves have been, or where wolves have successfully killed beavers. And what we see is that wolves kill beavers in a variety of spots around their ponds. And I'm going to walk through kind of where the spots are that wolves actually kill beavers, because this tells us a little bit about where beavers are vulnerable. So one of the common places that wolves kill beavers is at or below active beaver dams. Beavers go below these dams, and wolves seem to pick them off pretty easily there. That might be because wolves often cross beaver dams, so they encounter beavers sort of fortuitously. It could be because that's where beavers or wolves are waiting in ambush. So lots of reasons, but that's a common place we see kills. Another place that we see a lot of kills are called feeding areas. These are spots along shorelines where beavers are cutting trees right along the shoreline, and wolves will actually catch beavers that are there. Another place are feeding canals. So beavers, if you're not aware of this, have sort of this incredible ability to excavate out large canals in their ponds. And you can actually see a couple here. These are called feeding canals. So beavers literally dug out these tunnels. And the reason they do it is so that they can go further inland in water. This makes it easier for them to transport wood back to their lodge because they can float it as opposed to having to drag it. And it also provides them some protection. But also once they get in these little canals, they're also in a restricted space, and wolves have at some instances caught beavers in there and killed them. Feeding stations is another place. Beavers will sit in a pond and strip sticks on the shorelines of ponds. And you oftentimes, if you've been in the boundary waters or around beaver ponds, you'll see little piles of stripped sticks on the shoreline. And those are called, in sort of a little pile, those are called feeding stations. And wolves will catch beavers that are sitting on the shorelines like that. And those will be just kind of scattered around ponds or things like that. Probably the most common place, or one of the most common places we see wolves killing beavers, are on feeding trails. These are the foraging trails that beavers use to go into the woods to cut trees and bring them back. Obviously, as beavers get further from the pond, they get more vulnerable. And so we see wolves catching beavers in those spots. The forest interior, sometimes we just find beavers, typically young dispersing beavers who are looking for sort of new habitat. They'll cross over land or go through bogs or something like that, and wolves will kill them because beavers are far from water and super vulnerable. We've had a few instances now where wolves have actually killed beavers in ponds, where wolves have gone out somehow into the sort of shallow areas of ponds and successfully killed beavers, which is quite fascinating. They'll kill beavers on lodges sometimes, which is quite interesting. At scent mounds, beavers make little piles of mud along the banks of their ponds as a way to mark their territory. And so wolves will catch them at those spots. And so you'll see these little dirt mounds around the edges of their ponds. And then shorelines is not uncommon either, where beavers are feeding on vegetation on the shorelines. And then the last one is small waterways. So these are little waterways around the ponds that might go into another pond or something like that. Wherever things get narrow and shallow, those are spots that wolves can actually catch beavers. So what is quite interesting when we look at the patterns of where wolves kill beavers is that 29% of all the beavers that have been killed by wolves have actually been killed in water and then pulled out of that water source and killed on land. The reason that's interesting is it was thought prior to our work that beavers, once they were in water, were effectively immune to predation. And that probably is true when beavers are in really deep water. But even in water that's 2-3 feet deep, we've documented wolves killing beavers. And so that was quite interesting to think that even in water, beavers were not necessarily free of predation. So as we started visiting back in 2015, these clusters of GPS locations where wolves are spending time, not only did we find where wolves are killing beavers, but we started to also realize that wolves were spending a lot of time bedding down around beaver ponds, and they were wading next to beaver dams or feeding trails or some other places beavers were active. And so what it became apparent is that wolves were actually waiting to ambush beavers. And this was quite an insight because when we started doing our work, wolves were not thought of as ambush predators. They were thought of almost exclusively as cursorial predators, which means that they primarily hunt and kill their prey by outrunning and outlasting it. So the fact that we were able to document that wolves also used ambush strategies was really quite an insight. So when we started noticing this behavior, we started keeping track of them, and we called them, which isn't a very good name, but we called them beaver hunting attempts as a way to sort of classify these. And when we found these hunting attempts, which are basically just ambushing spots, we kept track of a bunch of different information, trying to understand why were wolves waiting in those particular spots. There obviously had to be some reason that they were doing it, so we were trying to get inside the mind of a wolf and try to capture all of the things they might be taking into account when choosing their ambushing locations. So, and this is a little schematic to try to understand this. So when we found one of these ambushing attempts, what we did is we kept track of where the wolf was bedded, and we measured how far the wolf was wading from the pond or the water source, how far the wolf was waiting from the feature that it presumably was expecting a beaver to be on. So in this one, that was a trail. It could have been a dam or some other features in other instances. We kept track of the features that wolves were choosing to wait next to. And then we also kept track of where the wolf was waiting in relation to what the wind direction was at that time. Because remember, beavers' primary way of detecting predators is scent. And so it would seem that wind direction would probably be an important thing to take into account if you're a wolf trying to catch a prey that primarily relies on scent. And ultimately, our real question was trying to answer where and how are wolves ambushing beavers? How are they doing this? And we had a couple predictions. Our first was that wolves would wait downwind of where beavers were going to be active because of for scent purposes, which seems pretty logical. The second was that wolves would choose to wait really close to where beavers are active on land because they know, we assumed or we speculated that wolves were aware that beavers can't really see them. And wolves would want to get as close as possible to a beaver before launching an ambushing attack because they don't want to give the beaver sort of a heads up so that the beaver can get back to water. Our third was sort of prediction was that when possible, wolves would try to wait as far away from water as possible. They would try to catch a beaver as far from water as they could because that would be beneficial for successfully killing the beaver. And then we also assumed that wolves would end up killing beavers sort of in the same places that they were actually waiting to ambush them. So these are kind of our four main predictions that we are interested in. So far in our project, we've been able to document almost 2,000 of these ambushing attempts from 42 different wolves over an 8-year period. And so I'm going to kind of walk through what did we find in relation to these different predictions. Well, for the first one, do wolves wait downwind of beaver activity? What we determined is that at 89% of these ambushing attempts, wolves were choosing to wait in downwind areas or places they would be undetected. And 5% of the instances, wolves were clearly upwind or they would have been detected. And in 6%, we just couldn't make a determination either way. But nonetheless, the fact that basically 90% of all of these attempts were downwind of where beavers would be on land seems to us to be pretty darn good evidence that wolves are choosing spots where beavers wouldn't be able to detect them via scent. So that was a pretty neat insight. What about this second one? Do wolves wait close to where beavers are active on land so that they can sort of launch an attack on beavers quickly? And what we found here is this is sort of a data, this is a histogram. So on our the y-axis here, we have the number of ambushing attempts. And then on the x-axis is the distance from beaver activity. And so what we see here is that on average, wolves wait about 2 to 3.5 meters from where beavers will be on land. In other words, wolves are waiting very close to where beavers are coming on land. And oftentimes, wolves are waiting sort of in the wide open. They're not waiting in areas with cover. So if a beaver was able to detect a wolf visually, there's no way the wolf would be able to wait there. But it seems that wolves are aware that beavers can't see them, so they pick spots really close to where beavers will be on land. So that sort of confirmed our second prediction, that wolves are waiting close to where beavers are coming out on land. And then our third prediction is, when possible, do wolves try to wait far away from water? And again, we can kind of look at this in a similar way, where we can kind of plot the results of these ambushing attempts. And so we can see on our y-axis here, this is the number of ambushing attempts again, and then this is the distance from water. And what we can see is that wolves, on average, are waiting about 7 to 10 meters from water. But we see kind of a curious pattern where we have a lot of ambushing attempts that are really close to water, and then there's quite a few that are a good distance from water here. And so it's kind of worth asking, what's going on here? Well, what we think is going on here is that most of the places that beavers are using on a day-to-day basis are right on the water. So if a wolf is waiting by a dam or a beaver lodge or something like that, it doesn't have any choice but to wait right by water. So if we really want to examine this question, we have to look at places where wolves actually have an option of, do they want to wait close to the water or farther away? And the perfect thing to do that, or perfect feature to look at that on are the trails that beavers use, because these trails can be very short and they can also be very long. And when they get longer, wolves actually have a choice. They can wait close to water or far away. So what we did is looked at only the ambushing attempts on these feeding trails, because that allowed us to kind of home in on this sort of prediction of ours. So if we look at just the feeding trails, what we would predict is that as these trails get longer, wolves would choose to wait further from water. That would be our prediction, which would indicate that wolves are sort of making a conscious decision to wait further from water. So when we found these ambushing attempts that were along these feeding trails. We measured the length of the trails and how far the wolf waited from water on those particular trails. And this was the results. We can see on the y-axis here, this is the distance the wolf was waiting from water, and this was the length of the feeding trail. And so the general impression is that as the trails get longer, wolves wait farther from water, which seems to support our hypothesis. Or does it? And so this is interesting. So this is what we first got, and we thought, my goodness, we have evidence they're choosing to wait further away from water. Isn't that great? But then it becomes really important to know, well, what would we expect if wolves were choosing spots randomly? What pattern would we actually get? And I'm not going to get into all the statistical approach here, but we basically modeled what would happen if you just randomly, wolves could just pick wherever they wanted. And so this is what we get. All these blue spots are randomly generated points. And what we find out is that if wolves are choosing spots randomly, this is the pattern we would get, is this green line. And what we got is the yellow line. And they were basically statistically the same, for better words. So really what we found is that wolves actually are just picking spots randomly, or at least we don't have evidence that they're not picking them sort of non-randomly. So basically, in other words, the reason we see this pattern is because as trails get longer, the average distance from water wolves wait is just going to increase. So for example, on a 10-meter trail, wolves are going to wait a little bit, are going to wait far from water. But as these trails get longer, the middle point of these trails is just going to be further from water by just pure chance or pure averages. So anyways, so we didn't find a relationship there. Okay, so on to our fourth prediction here. Do wolves kill beavers in the same places they wait to ambush them? And what we found is actually they don't match up very well at all. So where wolves are choosing to ambush beavers is very different than where they're killing them. And you can see here on the bottom, these are all those categories that were a little dry that I went through a bit earlier. And we went through them because these are important for understanding these patterns in predation. So there's a couple of things that we see big differences in. We see that almost 50% of all of the ambushing attempts from wolves are on these feeding trails, almost half. But only about 25% of their kills are on these spots. Whereas we see on these other categories, like small waterways, bunches of kills are on these small waterways and very few ambushing attempts are there. And then we have this category forest interior, where we have a bunch of kills and 0 attempts. And that's because these are just beavers killed in the middle of the woods. So the question becomes, if wolves are primarily ambushing beavers to kill them, why do we see such a disparity between these two? And it comes down to opportunism. So wolves will ambush beavers, but they also encounter them opportunistically when they're going about their territories doing other things. And so not all of these kills are actually going to be from wolves ambushing beavers. They're just going to be from chance encounters. And a lot of these chance encounters are very hard for us to measure, opportunistically. It's hard to know when you find a kill, was this because the wolf was ambushing it or because the wolf found it opportunistically? And that's just some of the limitations of using GPS collar data. But we think that most of the disparity we see is driven actually by wolf predation on dispersing beavers. So dispersing beavers are these young beavers that are leaving their families. They're going out to find habitats of their own. And when they're going to do this, they're traveling through these small little creeks, like we see in this photo, or they're going overland. And so when they're in these little creeks or going overland, they don't have deep water that they can return to. And so they're very vulnerable to predation, and wolves end up killing a lot of these young dispersing beavers. And so that's what we think is really driving this difference. Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this actually tell us about how wolves hunt and kill beavers? Well, the first one is that wolves appear to have at least a basic understanding of beaver behavior. Wolves understand, they come to a pond, wolves do, and they pick an ambushing spot where they likely can't see a beaver, can't hear a beaver, but they pick a spot knowing, with taking into account the wind direction, that beavers can smell them. So they pick a spot where the beavers won't be able to smell them, but they choose a spot really close to where the beavers will be on land, because they also know that the beavers can't see them. And so if they can't smell them and they can't see them, wolves can sort of have this perfect location. So in some sense, wolves sort of have the perfect hunting strategy to take advantage of beavers, which is really cool. The other thing it sort of indirectly tells us is that beavers are pretty hard for wolves to catch and kill. And the reason we think this is, we studied wolf predation on beavers for a long time. And what really shocked us is we have a very high density beaver population in our area. And wolves, certainly a big part of their diet is beavers. But wolves don't kill beavers nearly as frequently as we would have expected, given how many there are. And if you had read the scientific literature prior to our work, you'd have gotten this impression that killing beavers was actually very easy for wolves. It was almost like going to a vending machine. And if you couldn't catch a deer, you'd go to the pond and you'd get a beaver, and that would satisfy you. So here's just a few examples from the scientific literature. That book that I mentioned earlier by Dave Nietzsche and company, they concluded that a beaver's only defense is water, so once trapped on land by wolves, the beaver is doomed. Here's another one from 1971. Beaver are awkward and slow on land and undoubtedly easy prey for wolves to catch and kill. And then another one recently, on land, beaver are rather helpless when attacked by a large predator, and that was a study on how beavers respond to wolves. So all this suggests that this is pretty easy for wolves. But we actually think it's actually quite the opposite, that beavers are a lot more challenging for wolves to catch and kill. And so fortunately, a handful of years ago, someone in Quebec actually got a video of a wolf catching and killing a beaver. And this is the only video observation that exists of a wolf catching and killing a beaver, which is staggering. But we think this tells us a lot about about sort of wolf-beaver interactions. And I'm going to show the video and then talk a little bit about what we can make from it. Okay, so I'm not going to show the whole video because it goes on for a couple more minutes, but the wolf eventually killed the beaver. But I think what it shows us is that killing beavers really isn't so easy. And there's a few reasons why. The first one, which is not surprising, is that beavers fight back. So in this instance, the beaver is constantly turning around, it's biting at the wolf, doing anything it can to escape. In this video, in this frame that I captured here, the beaver actually did bite the wolf, and the wolf jumps back and lets go of the beaver. In this encounter, it didn't matter because they were a good ways from water. But you can imagine if they were on the edge of a pond or something like that, that would be the difference between the beaver probably living or dying. The other thing to note is this is a pretty small beaver. I would guess, it was maybe 15, 20 pounds. Like I said, adult beavers can be 50 to 60. So you can imagine if this beaver was 3 times as big as it is, or 2 times as big, this would be a very different interaction than it was here. The other thing worth noting is if you watch the video again, you can actually, right once the wolf pulls the beaver out of the woods, the beaver gets away and it goes for a run for probably about, I don't know, 20 feet or something before the wolf catches it again. In this instance, that wasn't very important because they weren't by water. But if you're on near water, that little sort of jaunt might be enough to allow a beaver to get back to water and escape a wolf. And so given all of these sort of little insights, it seems very, very likely that there are beavers who escape wolves, and that wolves have to be very strategic when they attack and kill beavers, that they can't just show up and kind of run at a beaver and kill it. They have to be in a good position to actually successfully kill it. And luckily, there actually is some data from Voyageurs National Park that does indicate that there are beavers that have escaped encounters with wolves. So for the past 15 or so years, biologists and voyageurs have been tagging beavers and live trapping them and releasing them. And when they do it, they take a variety of measurements. And one of the things they take measurements on are beavers' tails. And they have found several beavers that have these mysterious circular puncture wounds in their tails. And these aren't from, bullets or anything like that. These are clearly natural wounds. And the question becomes, what's circular that could punch a hole in a beaver's tail? Well, all we have to do is watch this video, and what's the wolf doing? It's grabbing the beaver's tail and pulling it around. And so it seems very likely that there are several beavers and voyageurs that we've been able to document, have these puncture wounds that have escaped predation by getting back to water. So that's sort of a very brief summary distilled into hopefully a relatively succinct package about kind of what we've learned so far. But there's still a lot of stuff to be learned that we haven't examined yet. Questions like, when are wolves hunting beavers? Are they choosing to ambush beavers when beavers are most active on land? What age beavers are wolves killing? Are wolves killing the young beavers, which are likely easier for them to catch and kill? Or are they primarily killing older beavers? Older beavers are generally on land more than younger beavers, so it seems possible that that might be the case. They kill older beavers, but older beavers are likely also a lot more challenging to kill because they're larger. And then, do different wolves have different hunting strategies? Wolves have, like dogs or other animals, they have unique sort of personalities and they do things differently. So it seems likely that some have sort of developed different behaviors or different ways to ambush beavers than others. So these are just a handful of the questions that we hope to kind of investigate in the years to come. And with that, I just need to thank all these different funding sources that range from groups in Minnesota, like the International Wolf Center, Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, Voyageurs Conservancy, the U of M, Voyageurs National Park, to a bunch of other groups as well. Wildlife Science Center is another one, and then a bunch of private donors. A lot of our project funding comes from grants and then private donors. So a lot of this work wouldn't be possible without that help. And then just a little plug for the science. So this paper or this talk was sort of, like I said, a distillation of a lot of science we've done and based on 4 specific papers that we've published. If you're interested in getting into the weeds about what we've learned, you can go to our website, voyagerswolfproject.org, and PDFs of all of these papers are available for free, where you can read more about kind of what we've learned about wolves and beavers. And with that, I'll take any questions from folks as long as we have time. And just another note, if you are interested in kind of tagging along with the project, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. So I'll take any questions.
I have a question on how smart beavers are. So if majority of times wolves are capturing or trying to capture beavers downwind, how often are beavers eating upwind? Do they sense the wind? You know what? I'm going to go upwind so I'm safer.
Well, that is a good question, and I have no idea. So one of the challenges we have, and one of the challenges about beavers in general, is it's really hard to understand beaver movements because beavers are very hard to fit tracking devices on because they go underwater and they don't have necks. And you gotta be very careful with animals that go underwater not to put tracking devices that could get caught on, let's say, sticks and things. So we don't know, unfortunately, it's a fascinating question, because you're right, there is sort of this reciprocal, like any predator-prey interaction, the predators are trying to figure out the prey, and the prey are trying to respond to the predators. And beavers certainly have adaptations to kind of avoid getting killed. The question is figuring out what those are. I don't know about the wind direction. I do think one thing that beavers do, which we just have to find a way to show, is that I think a lot of the way beavers avoid getting caught by predators or by wolves is their foraging behavior, which is where, wolves are spending most of their time ambushing beavers along trails that beavers are using to forage. And what I suspect is that beavers' foraging behavior is really random in some sense. It's very unpredictable. So we did a big camera trap study where we put cameras on these feeding trails trying to catch, so we could understand beaver foraging behavior. And what was really amazing about it is we would go to spots where beavers were clearly cutting trees and put a camera on the trail, and we would get almost no activity on the trail. And then all of a sudden, for like a week and a half, and then all of a sudden you'd have 3 days of beavers would be foraging really intensively, and they'd stop. And then you'd have another trail somewhere else. And it was like the opposite. It was like beavers were almost like sort of randomly foraging in these spots. And what I suspect is, from a purely behavioral or sort of like adaptive standpoint, it makes sense that the best way to avoid a predator waiting in ambush is to make yourself unpredictable, so they can't pattern your behavior. And so that's my guess. The question is just it's challenging to demonstrate that that's exactly what's going on, but that's my suspicion of the primary way beavers are avoiding wolves.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I've noticed that too. I have a chinchilla, and they're just random. They just what they're gonna do, you have no idea.
Yep. Yeah. It's amazing.
And today I had something. When you talk about rodent behavior, I caught a mouse today in a mouse trap, and I let it go 2 miles from my home because it's a live trap,
Mm-hmm.
And the mouse was just freaking out. I mean, he was just running in circles and going around, and it's just incredible how random his movement was. He was, I felt bad because it's almost worse to let him go alive just because he was so stressed out,
Sure.
And you could see that in that video too. The beaver's response to what the wolf was doing is very erratic, and I think that's part of their defense too, is that wolf doesn't know what that beaver was going to do,
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And yeah, I think too, we see with even encounters like that, you see a beaver that has no idea it's going to get ambushed. They live their whole life probably with a certain level of baseline fear, but they never know when they're just going to get plucked out of a stream or something like that. So it definitely probably shapes how they behave with that sort of background, like risk always there when they're making decisions that something like that might happen.
Are you filming?
No, I've got a quick question. I noticed
Mm-hmm.
you'd never showed them hunting as a pack, or are most of the wolves up there kind of working on their own?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So during the summertime, most wolves are actually hunting by themselves. So we typically think of, like, during the winter time, wolves are typically moving around as a cohesive unit. But during the summertime, wolves are actually primarily hunting by themselves and hunting and killing prey by themselves. We have documented some instances of wolves with other collared wolves, we presume are cooperatively trying to ambush beavers, where they're both bedding down around beaver trails or something like that. So that definitely happens, but it's but that's not the norm, I would say. Typically, they're by themselves. And probably comes down to an energetic standpoint. When wolves kill beavers, there's probably something energetically that there's just not enough food to go around, and so it's actually better for wolves long term to hunt by themselves. And they might kill prey maybe less frequently than if they're together, but they still might get more food for each kill if they don't have to share it.
I did see a lone wolf chase a deer once when we were camping in Four Town Lake a long time ago. A deer hit a tree behind us and booked off and we saw the wolf at a distance. It had chased the deer through our campsite.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
But I have a suspicion that this was like a scout, like he was probably herding that deer into the pack, because we saw evidence that there was pack activity on the lake. So just makes sense that would be one of their ways of catching deer anyway. It's not beavers, but
sure,
they probably herd the deer into the rest of the pack to do the kill,
Yeah, and I do think that's one of the reasons why we've been so interested in beavers, is beavers are such a different type of prey for wolves compared to deer and moose and different things they hunt. And so I think that's what makes them so fascinating, and why I was kind of saying like I enjoy studying it, is because it is so different from a lot of the other prey. And so you get to kind of look at sort of a very unique situation where they have to come up with unique hunting strategies to kill them.
You may have explained this a little bit, but what did the beaver eat? Are they and do the wolves kind of go to maybe where the beavers eat?
Yeah,
As a strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So beavers primarily in the summertime are going to be eating, they'll be cutting trees, but typically actually during the summertime, beavers are cutting smaller stems like hazel, willow, things like that, and then relying on abundant sort of herbaceous vegetation around their ponds, as well as aquatic vegetation that's actually growing in their ponds. Fall is though when beavers sort of switch to going inland and cutting trees more extensively. But where wolves, a lot of times where wolves are focusing are on the trails that beavers are using to go inland to cut stuff, either herbaceous vegetation or trees or little stems and things like that. And so that's not entirely surprising, because that's just where beavers are going to be most vulnerable on land, is when they're having to go further away from water to actually get food. And so wolves seem to have at least figured that out to some extent.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. This was really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we'll look forward to whatever your next presentation is.
Sure. Yes, absolutely.